From the Library of Congress and the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture.
Set here first, and then
Okay, we are rolling, so David, if you want to give the slate.
Okay.
Well, first let me say that you're on channel 2.
Okay.
And Mr. Dixon's on channel 1.
Okay. So this is David Cline. I'm on channel 2. I'm be talking today with Mr. Elmer Dixon, who is on channel 1. We are in Seattle, Washington. Today's date is February the 28th, 2013. Again, this is David Cline for the Smithsonian and Mr. Elmer Dixon.
Okay, so we're rolling.
Okay. So I wanted to thank you very much again for meeting with me today to tell your story. And what I'd like to do is start by just having you talk a little bit about the family that you were raised in, where they came, how you ended up here in Seattle, and what kind of a home and values you feel that you were raised with.
Okay. Yeah, my both parents were originally from Chicago. Actually, my father was from Kentucky, born in Kentucky, but moved to Chicago at a young age and was raised there. And my mother was raised in Chicago as well, but her parents had come up through the great southern migration from the south, from Mississippi. And so both of them had, well, my mother clearly southern roots. My grandmother used to say that Kentucky's not the South, it's a border state. but as we know, it's got some southern aspects to it. But so I was born in Chicago and spent my early years between Chicago and Champaign, Illinois, where my father worked at an Air Force base. He actually was a World War II vet, but he was an illustrator who graduated from the Chicago Art Institute. And so he worked on illustrating engineers' designs for aircraft or aircraft parts. And he eventually decided to move away from Illinois. I think he loved Chicago and the Chicago area, but he was an adventuresome sort, and you know, part of that story is, of course, he wanted to get as far as he could away from his mother-in-law. But so he got an opportunity to work at Boeing, and this would have been in 1957, and as an illustrator. And of course, back then, you know, there were no computer enhancements or computer drawings. Everything was done by hand. And that's what brought us to the Northwest. One of the things that I reflect on when I tell, you know, my story and my transition, I did a presentation in Lille, France in 2010. And it was at a conference with an organization called the Society for Intercultural Education, Training and Research. And for the last 26 plus years, I've been doing work in the field of diversity and cross-cultural communication. And during that span of time, and I'll come back around to this, during that span of time, you know, we have a lot of corporate clients, and so the identity, my identity as a Panther, never was talked about or spoken about. Only people in the Northwest who were clients, who knew of my past, knew that I was connected to the Black Panther Party. But you know, our corporate clients, I mean, I've sat in offices with the CEO of PepsiCo and other major companies around the United States, and no one ever knew. But here was an opportunity at this particular, they call it a Congress that CIATAR Europa holds every 3 to 4 years. At this particular CIATAR conference in France, the theme of their conference was human rights and cultural diversity. Where do you draw the line? And I saw that as a perfect opportunity to talk about that topic because of my own experiences as a member of the Black Panther Party and also as an interculturalist through the work that I do. And so, in fact, my speech was titled From Revolutionary to Interculturalist. But I think that's a kind of an interesting concept as I've thought about it, because I actually probably began my early life in some ways as an interculturalist and never knew it, never realized it at the time. And that was because of the values that our parents instilled in us, but also the environment that we grew up in. In Chicago, we lived on the south side. I stayed with my grandmother on my mother's side of the family for a couple of years as a young toddler. But on the south side of Chicago, then as today, it's largely a segregated community, largely black. And in Champaign, while I don't remember much about the neighborhood in Champaign, I know we were in a housing project there, I don't remember too many different color friends at that young age. I don't know if I would have noticed, but I knew that, looking back, I know that in Chicago on the south side it was a black community. When we moved to Seattle, and it took us a couple of years to settle in the home that our mother still lives in Madrona. We moved in that home in 1960, and as a 10-year-old, moving into this neighborhood in Madrona, it was like landing in the proverbial melting pot, if you will. I don't like to refer to the U.S. as a melting pot, more like a salad bowl rather than a melting pot. But that was the neighborhood in which we landed in. It was a neighborhood that had been maybe 30, 40 years earlier, a predominantly white neighborhood, a Jewish neighborhood. There were synagogues in the area. And what happened, as happened in most inner cities, as blacks moved in, whites would move out. But in this particular neighborhood, a little bit of everyone moved in. Yeah. And so on the playground, which is across the street from our home that we grew up in, it was the gathering place. And I tell you could go on into that on that playground and interact with white kids who were average income, rich white kids who lived across the red zone line, which happened to be 2 blocks from our home. We didn't know it at the time, the redlining district. And there was Chinese, there were Japanese, there were Filipino, there were Latino, Mexican American. It was just everybody was there, and black, of course. Right. And while it was, I think, largely black, it had, I say maybe percentage-wise, but everybody else was there as well. And so that was the environment in which we grew up in and the schools that we attended. But the other side of that was the influences that our parents had on us. Right. And while they had grown up or gone through life, their adult life and early life, with some consciousness of what was going on in America, I don't know how you could be unconscious to it in the 40s, 50s, 60s. My father, when he was, I think he was in high school at the time or had just graduated when Pearl Harbor was bombed. And he and his buddies, who had formed and they may have been in their first year of college, had formed a group called the Four Feathers that was named after the Four Feathers at Notre Dame. And they actually had sweaters, which my mom still has the sweater today, with the feather on it and the number 4 on it. And they were a tight-knit group. They all went out and they volunteered for the draft because they wanted to fight and defend their country. And when they were able to...
and these are 4 black men?
These are 4 black men. Yeah. And they were able to get it through the induction process, and they were assigned their orders to go to boot camp. They had some city on there that they didn't know where it was, and I think it said MS at the end, and they were thinking they were going to Massachusetts or someplace. Well, as it turned out, they were going to Mississippi. And so when they got down there, of course, in segregated living quarters, you know, segregated camp, if you will. They would drill and you know, go through the regular rigors of boot camp in preparation for, you know, preparing to fight at some point. And on probably more than one occasion, as my father recounted these stories, if you kind of remember any of the old movies where soldiers are marching off to you know, to fight in this big war, they called World War II the big one, and the confetti would be flying and people would be standing on the side of the street waving flags and, you know, cheering them on, you know, as they got ready to go out and defend America. And so when they walked through this Mississippi town, they weren't greeted by confetti and flags. They were greeted by crowds that were booing and hissing at them and spitting and throwing things and calling them nigger. And it was, you know, it was, well, I'm sure my father wasn't oblivious to this, but it was kind of a rude awakening, you know, in 1942 or 43, whenever that was, that they were getting ready to go put their lives on the line to defend America. They had this strong sense of pride and patriotism to go defend the United States after the attack on Pearl Harbor and to be treated like that. But those and other incidents that occurred, you know, my mother had her fair share of incidents about her color. Never, those things never colored their perception of other people. Mm-hmm. It never left them with a negative sense of who other people were or are. And so we always learn to you know, as Dr. King used to say, judge people by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. And I think that was one of the principal values that we grew up with that was so strong in our household. And so I remember, you know, during those early years and as we were, you know, developing and living in this environment, that my father had a fierce protective sense about his family and about his kids. And I remember on one occasion, I had two very close friends out of all of these kids that I met. I tended to be kind of an outgoing kid. And on our block there was a black family that was large, that was at the end of our street, and there was a white family next door to them. In fact, everybody in the neighborhood called the woman Auntie Barbara. So she was like, you know, she was like the auntie. You know, you always hear about auntie. And she was a white woman, and then her son. Actually, I think it was maybe her either her grandson or stepson was a good friend of ours. But my two best friends were two young white guys who I had met through school, and we used to hang out a lot. But we always used to get in our mischief as well. And I remember we used to go and, you know, get eggs from the local store and go throw them at passing cars. And one evening we were out tossing eggs, and my brother Aaron was with us at the time, and everybody had tossed the eggs and took off, and we missed the car. Mm-hmm. And so I wasn't leaving. I was determined to land my egg, and a car came through. I didn't notice it was the same car that had barely gotten missed before, and I launched my egg, and as it hit, the car stopped. The guy got out and ran up and grabbed me, and I don't think he meant any real ill. I think he was, you know, trying to scold me and tell me that was not right or whatever. But here I was, you know, 11 or 12 years old, and I was, you know, like petrified and mad and you know, struggling and got away and ran. It was more than a block from our home, and ran to the house and you know, burst through the door and told my father this man was attacking me, and he grabbed the nearest thing he could grab, a hammer or whatever, and went right out the door. You know, because no one was going to attack his kid. But that was, you know, that fierce protection of your family was one thing that we learned. And so on any given weekend, my parents would have, you know, guests over, And they, on one weekend, they might have one of their black friends over, a black couple, and they would sit down and listen to Ellington and, you know, Count Basie. And we grew up with a lot of music in our house. And then on other occasions, there would be different people that would come over. And I remember on Saturday mornings, many times that we would get up and it was wax the floor days. And my mother still lives in this big house. It's a big, huge 4-bedroom house built around the turn of the 20th century, like in 1908. It's a very sturdy, big home. And we would have to push back the furniture, roll up the carpets, and on our hands and knees, the boys, not my sister, she got off of that duty. We had to
How
get
many
off.
are there in your family?
There's 4 of us.
Okay.
And she's the oldest, and then the three boys, and I'm the middle son. And so we had to get on our hands and knees and wax these hardwood floors to a high luster. And while we were doing so, my father would have playing on the hi-fi La Boheme, Madame Butterfly, The Tales of Hoffmann. So we learned an appreciation for opera at a very young age, and so it was we had a full range of appreciation of different kinds of music. That was, again, that kind of broad kind of cultural overlay. But we found out later why we had to polish the floors, because on certain nights of the month, he would invite his Scandinavian friends over, and they were from various parts of Scandinavia and lived in various parts of the city, but they were all white. A couple of them were Jewish, and they would come in and they would do these loud Scandinavian dancing on the floor. You could hear the wooden floors just rocking with this with these dances, these Scandinavian dances. And so when I think about the cross-cultural experiences that we had as kids, we would go over some of the Jewish friends' homes on Easter, actually on their Passover. And I ate my first matzah ball when I was probably 11 years old, and gained a high appreciation and liking for Jewish culture, and especially the eating of the festive food that they ate. And they would come over and maybe share an Easter dinner with us. There was almost like a cultural exchange that was going on there. And on other occasions, the two white friends that I mentioned, one was his mother was a second generation, I believe she was second generation Russian. I know her mother was first generation, his grandmother. And so we would go over there, I would go over their house on Christmas celebrations, and they were Orthodox Christians, and they ate certain kind of foods that were very unique to that Russian culture. And so it was a pretty interesting experience growing up in that neighborhood. Chinese immigrants, and they're very well known in the community. And I remember once after one of my friends taught me how to steal candy bars, I was nervous as heck. You were asking me whether or not I would get nervous. I don't get nervous talking, but I remember when I was trying to steal this one candy bar, I was probably so nervous, because it was outside of my what I believed one should do. But he said, "No, you can do it. Get it." And May caught me. And for the next, I think, 20 years, she called me bad boy. But she would joke about it in later years. But it was a close relationship that everyone had in that neighborhood. And as I said, we came from so many different cultural backgrounds. It was an important development in our lives and eventually in mine, in terms of this full circle, in terms of the work that I do today.
And I imagine you're just a quick pause. Yeah.
Now we're going again.
Okay. I was going to ask for your father at Boeing, which I imagine wasn't a largely African-American workforce. I mean, I imagine he had to navigate that world as well.
You know, I'm not sure how much he had to navigate. I'm sure he did have to navigate, but he was, there's, you know, we talk about influences. There are several things that I pulled from my experience growing up with my parents, and one of the things that two of the things that I got from my father was his outgoingness. Mm-hmm. You know, everybody loved him, and he could make friends like in a minute. You know, he was very, I guess charismatic is one way to put it, but he was very smooth. He was easy to get along with. And so he made friends very quickly at Boeing. In fact, many of those people, I suppose that he met many of them at Boeing. I'm sure all of them did not work at Boeing. He had to meet them in some other connection, you know. I know that he had some connection with some of the civil rights organizations, as well as I think even there may have been, you know, kind of the taboo back then, the Communist Party members, you know. I don't know to what degree he interacted with those folks, but all of those people that I mentioned who I've known through adulthood have all had very progressive so he was a very outgoing person, and that was one of the things that I absorbed from his personality. The other thing was the adventurism. He was always looking to find some adventure in life. I remember there was a program on TV back when we were growing up called Adventures in Paradise, and this ship called the Kon-Tiki would sail around the world and stop in exotic places, and he had been stationed in Hawaii during his tour. He ended up in other thing I took from him, I think what it resulted in for me personally was a kind of a can-do attitude, which would come into play initially when I got into the Black Panther Party, and later in life as I, you know, embarked on, you know, my own personal life. Because as a member of the Black Panther Party, we were all in for the community, and we didn't have any selfish desires or individual desires at that point. Sitting in front of the TV and kind of mimicking the soldiers as they were marching, you know, along with his coffin, and seeing Ruby assassinated on live TV. Not Ruby, but Oswald being assassinated on live TV. I remember Medgar Evers being shot. I remember the bombing of the you know, on nightly TV. You know, it seemed like, you know, we were all, you know, after we had a routine, of course, as I think many families did then, and maybe today still, where when we got home, you know, we had to finish our homework before we could go out to the park or go do something. Homework was done, dinner was on the table at 6 o'clock, and we had to be there at the table. It was important to my father that we eat around the table together as a family. We did that every night. And then after dinner was over, wash the dishes, put them away, because everybody had a routine. In fact, I used that same routine when I was raising my family. Someone washed, someone dried, and someone put them away. And so after that was done, then there was time to watch TV, and and then of course I remember on the nightly evening news spots, seeing the incidents like the Bloody Sunday on the Pettus Bridge, and demonstrators being beaten by police and hosed by firefighters and bitten by police dogs, and those were very vivid scenes, and I think it was painful, for me, and that I was a young boy growing up who. While I had aspirations of being a doctor, I think that a lot of kids relate to, people that kind of protect the community, and so being a police officer or a firefighter was, a position that you looked at with, with respect, and seeing that dichotomy with these protectors of society, being brutal and being the opposite of what you would expect was an interesting way to view, how things were shaking out in our real world. And I didn't realize it at the time, but those things would become part of my psyche and part of my growth and development. One of my colleagues that I work with today, he talks about the effects of racism, and he says that it's not a single incident. Sometimes people ask you, so when have you been discriminated against, or what has happened to you? And it's not a single incident. He calls it a series of microabrasions. It's like when you have a wound or a sore, and it scabs over, and you keep picking at the scab because it's bothering you. That over time it's like this wound that never goes away. And he compares the experience of in its whole of racism and oppression and all of the things that have occurred, not only to blacks but other people that have been oppressed, as this series of microabrasions. So as I saw these things, they were having some impact, but I didn't realize just how so. And it was in the summer of, I believe, 1967. It was either 67 or 66.
What year were you born?
I was born in 1950. So I was a 16-year-old or 17-year-old at the time. That my brother Aaron, being a year older than me, was his awareness point actually happened before mine, and we would talk about these occurrences, but I wasn't fully into this awareness piece yet. And it was also an interesting time because in the mid 60s, the Black awareness movement was happening, and it hadn't hit me yet. I don't think it hit our city yet. In '65, I was still skateboarding with my my two very close white friends. We would go up to Crater Lake, which is the second deepest lake in the world, and went up there with his parents, his mother, and siblings, and we got on our skateboards and skateboarded down. That was in '65. So I was at 15-year-olds at the time, and so I hadn't gotten into awareness of who I was as a black person, and my brother, it was like I said, either 67 or 66 or 67, invited or told me that I needed to go hear this speaker that was coming to Garfield High School, and the speaker's name was Stokely Carmichael. And I didn't know much about Stokely. I had heard a little bit. Aaron and I talked a little bit, but I did know that I was aware of the Watts rebellions and the Detroit rebellions. It's an interesting thing. Of course, people refer to them as riots, the Watts riots and the Detroit riots. There was a well-known a musician and writer who wrote several high-profile R&B songs that were successful on the charts. And the songwriter, was white. And after the Watts and Detroit rebellions, he wrote an essay in which he said that the rebellions in Detroit and Watts were a natural response to the conditions in which those people lived. And because of that, he was blacklisted. He didn't get any record contracts for another 10, 15 years. And so I was aware of those things, but it hadn't, kind of meshed for me yet, all of those things that were occurring. And so I went to hear Stokely, and I remember vividly the things that Stokely Carmichael was talking about. And one of the things I remember him saying was that the problem with the black community is black people don't love themselves. And he said, you hate the color of your skin and you want to be white. And he said, look at how you've been programmed. When you go to a movie theater and you see the good knight and the white knight, or the bad knight, why is the good knight always on a white horse and the bad knight always on a black horse? When you turn on your TV and you look at a Western, why is the good cowboy dressed in white, wears a 10-gallon hat, and rides a horse named Trigger, and a white horse named Trigger, and the bad cowboy is named Dirty Bart, and he's in black clothes and on a black horse. And he said even when you go sit down and eat food and you order a cake, a dessert, and angel food cake is white and devil's food cake is black. And he made all of these analogies, and I was thinking, that has nothing to do with anything. I don't hate the fact that I'm black. And after I'd left that rally, and I was sitting on the playground. I remember I was sitting on the tennis courts, and the tennis courts are the playground and the tennis courts are right across the street from our house. So during the summer months, that's when our parents were at work, we would go to the playground and either play in the community center or play tennis. And I began to think about what he had said, and think about some of the occurrences in my own life. And I remember thinking about our tennis team, because here we were a tennis team that was predominantly black, and an instructor who came to teach us the finer points of the game. Her name was Miss Sullivan. She came as a I don't know if she was a volunteer or a worker who came through the park department, and she was I think she was either a student at the University of Washington or was recently graduated from there. But anyway, she taught us the finer points about tennis, and everybody loved Miss Sullivan. She was cute too, and that year. We had won all of our tournaments and had won the right to go play for the city championship. And the city championship was being held not 15, 20 blocks from our house, across the red line, which we didn't know existed, but down on the lake at the Seattle Tennis Club. And so we got on our tennis whites and our little shirts that said Madrona on it, and when she got us down into the tennis club, and we were sitting in the cafeteria waiting for our turn to go out on the tennis court, and in walked this tall black man in kitchen whites, and he looked at us black kids sitting there and he said, "What are you doing in here? You better get back there and get your clothes on and get to work." Well, he thought we were the help, some hired help for maybe an event that they were having. And as it turned out, of course, they didn't allow blacks in the tennis club. And, we didn't know that. So we told him, we're here to play tennis. And he thought we were joking. We actually went out and beat the other team, which happened to be a white team. And the tennis club, along with, like the park, some park department officials. I can't believe they were park department officials that would have done this. They had to have been officials at the tennis tournament at the Seattle Tennis Club. left before giving us our trophies. They didn't have a trophy presentation. We were supposed to have a trophy presentation out on the court, and they left before and didn't give us our trophies. And it was because we were in their all-white tennis club. And I remember thinking about that, and thinking about my, a few other things that occurred. My mother, when we moved here, and she had gone for an interview for a job she had found in the newspaper. And when she got there, they told her that the position was filled. And she said, well, I just saw it in the paper. And they said, but yeah, we filled it since then. And she had called down to see if it was still open. And so she went back, and I don't know if she went to a phone booth or whatever, and she called them again and said, I'm inquiring about this position. And they said, oh, sure, come down and
right.
We'd like you to apply. I remember hearing about, hearing those things and observing these things. But all the while, there was my friends who were white, the pastor at our church who was white. I had a good relationship with people. So it wasn't about black and white. And I thought to myself, I don't want to be white. I like who I am. But sometimes I maybe wish that I had some of the things that they had. You see, my two white friends who lived on the other side of the red line, they lived in the neighborhood just 2 blocks away was upscale. One of them, in fact, even had a maid, and their maid's name was Hazel. There used to be a 1960s
Sure.
TV show,
Yeah.
Hazel.
Yeah.
And and as I thought, I wanted, the things that they had, which were nicer than mine, but I didn't want to be white, I don't think. But that's kind of where the awareness of my own skin color and the fact that I needed to be prideful in it began. And
so did Stokely's words kind of rattled around?
Stokely's words rattled around. And so my brother and I knew that we had to be involved. He had already this was now in the fall of '67. He had started at the University of Washington and was in the Black Student Union with perhaps one of the other people you may be interviewing, Larry Gossett. I was now a senior going into high school, and I had actually joined SNCC and was appointed the co-chair of the Seattle chapter of SNCC. And we would try to do some community organizing, but most of the organizing was around voter registration. That was one of the big things during the civil rights movement, was registering black people to vote, because of the conditions in the South, really kind of pushed this civil rights movement across the United States. And so we did some of the same things that they were doing, and one was voters registration. But we felt like we didn't have much direction, and we were contemplating, how can we make an impact. And I was politicized by then. I was aware of who I was, and I was becoming politically aware and standing up. And in fact, I, along with 4 or 5 of my closest friends at Garfield, decided that we were going to have a black student union at Garfield. And we were met with all kinds of opposition. Of course, when we went to the principal with our idea, he said, no, you can't have a black student union. You don't need one. You have a boys club. Of course, boys was a derogatory term back then, which in fact, to the credit of one of my, who's deceased now, one of my classmates, who was student body president, got the name changed to the Garfield Men's Club. But we said, yeah, but that's for the whole student body. We need something to speak for the rights of of black students. And he said, no, we're not going to do that. And so we were adamant that we were going to have a black student union. And so we did several kind of things to agitate. I was in the what they called the stage band and the jazz band. I had learned to play trumpet, and all of us kids had picked up an instrument, but I was the one that stayed with mine the longest. I was in the marching band. I was the drum major of the band. I was in the concert band, both in junior high and into high school. and I was in kind of now the elite band, which was the jazz band, and they called it the stage band because we got to play at the pep rallies. And so one of the things that as I became politicized, when the Pledge of Allegiance was, said every morning, I wouldn't stand up for the Pledge of Allegiance. When we had to play at the pep rallies to play the Star Spangled Banner at the start of the pep rally, I would sit down and play the Star Spangled Banner. I got kicked out of school on a couple of occasions because I wouldn't adhere to, the rules. And on one morning we decided, well, we're going to throw off this pep rally and to gain recognition, and we did this chant where I would start and then they would echo in the stand, and it went something like bing bing bang bang Ungawa Black Power. So people would echo what we said, and then when we did that, the whole student body just erupted. Everybody, black students, white students, Asian, all of them just erupted. And so I got kicked out of school for that. But then, so we decided, well, we were kind of putting the pressure on. We decided, well, we're going to call a boycott. And we told the principal, if you don't give us a BSU, we're going to boycott classes. And he said, yeah, well, it'll only be you and your friends, and then we'll expel you again. And so what he didn't realize was that for most of those white students, the Asian students, the Latino students, we'd all gone to school together from grade school on up. And most of them were our friends. They were, and so when we called, and plus I was the drum major of the marching band. Everybody in school knew who I was. And so when we called the boycott, the only people that went to class were the honor students. And the hallway in Garfield filled up in front of the principal's office. No one was going to class. And the principal sent out his messenger, and they relented. We got a black student union, and we were actually the first high school black student union on the West Coast. And so, I was becoming more now kind of aware of not only my own self and developing a political consciousness, but there were a few incidents that were kind of projecting me into a leadership role. There was a couple of minor scrapes. I'd never been arrested before. I remember coming back from a high school basketball game, which I had played. I had my trumpet with me, and I went down to one of the local spots where teens gathered, which happened to be, in fact, in front of our rival high school, Franklin High School, and it was like a big riot going on. I'd kind of landed in the middle of a riot, and I didn't realize what was happening, but I got out anyway to see why police were throwing tear gas and dispersing kids, and there was this one black girl that I knew, Deborah Rodriguez, who was being pinned to the ground by two officers, and I was asking her, are you all right? What's get your knee off of her back. And the next thing I knew, I was being, whisked away, handcuffed, and taken off, and to juvenile, and I was charged with inciting a riot, because I was speaking out, against this young black woman being, brutalized by these cops. And when I went before the judge, I wouldn't relent. But what he said was, I'm not going to sentence you to any time, but I'd like you to write an essay on why you thought it was important to defend that young woman. And so I did. Around this same time, there was a few incidents happening at that high school, Franklin High School. There had been a fight between 4 students, and Franklin was almost about as diverse as Garfield. Okay. This fight between 2 white students had nothing to do with race, but the 2 white students were sent back to class. The 2 black students were expelled. There was a young black woman who showed up one day with an afro, and the principal. She was sent to the principal's offices, and she was told she was expelled from school and told she could come back to school when she had an appropriate hairdo. And that was kind of the last straw. And the students at at Franklin, the black students there wanted to organize and wanted one to get this young woman reinstated in the school, and they wanted a black student union. And of course, they had gotten the same answer that we had gotten. So they called Larry, who was at the UW, and called me at Garfield. And so several of us at Garfield and the UW, including my brother Aaron, came to Franklin, met with the students, and then we walked across the street and walked into the principal's office and took over the principal's office and had a sit-in in his office and told him we were taking over his office until they addressed these concerns and gave the students some representation through a black student union. They fled the office, and we ended up staying in the building overnight. The next morning, the phone rang, and we were doing business. We answered the phone. Good morning, Franklin High School. And it was the administration, and they said, "Look, you can have. We'll address these demands. They'll get a BSU. Please leave our building." So we left the building, and it was about a week later. I was in my geometry class at Garfield, and the phone rang, and Mr. Naramore said that someone in the office wants you in the office, which wasn't unusual. I had been called to the office on a number of occasions. So I stepped outside of the office, and in the hallway were two detectives who read me my rights and handcuffed me and proceeded to escort me out of the school. And I was being arrested for unlawful assembly. And unbeknownst to me at the time, my brother Aaron, Larry Gossett, and several other leaders, both at the UW and at the two high schools, were being arrested almost simultaneously. And within the hour, it had to be within the hour or so, King was assassinated. And we knew that they had gotten us off of the street because they wanted to get leaders potentially that could cause, some confusion for them off of the street. So all of the leaders of the radical leaders they had gotten, the black radical leaders they had gotten, and put us in jail. I was in juvenile because I was underage. And I remember being in juvenile and seeing.
What did they charge you with?
Unlawful assembly.
Okay, from the Franklin
incident.
Yeah.
And I remember seeing the cities burning across the U.S. and James Brown was in D.C. and they had been trying to do a concert, and he was trying to tell people, don't go out and burn your neighborhoods. He was exhorting people not to riot and not to burn, but to no avail. People were mad. And my parents, when they came to pick me up that evening, that night, to get me out of juvenile, they had realized that both of their sons were in jail now, their two older sons. And when they picked me up, the only thing they said to me was, "Are you all right?" And then we drove home in silence. And the feeling was palpable, in terms of them being distraught over the assassination of King on the one hand, and the fact that their two sons were in jail that same day. It was as if they knew something was going to change in their lives and in their sons' lives. And
do you remember talking with them about, you're talking about how your own consciousness is, whether you were having these conversations with your folks.
Yeah, well, the whole cross-cultural experience, I think, was kind of an unspoken thing. I think they had put us in the environment, and so, and as I said, I wasn't aware of, I thought that's the way life was supposed to be. And so I wasn't aware of what its impact was on me growing up. I think when I was becoming aware, I don't remember having the conversation with them. I think that, like I said, when we went and marched with King, and my father said, we're going to go to this march, and we thought that was important because he said it was, and we knew that we had seen stuff on TV, and they had talked. We had talked about probably the Bloody Sunday and the bombing of the church, and we had talked about those kind of things. But in terms of my own personal, it wasn't like they were directing me and trying and observing this progression. These were things that were happening internal, right. And so I didn't discuss. They were aware when I was arrested the first time for inciting a riot, and I had been interviewed by a newspaper. In fact, I'll show you the clip here after we're done. When I was 17, right in the middle of that, and you could see my afro. I had the SNCC jacket on, and they were asking me about the Vietnam War, and my words to them was, they were asking if I thought it was a war worth fighting in, and my response, and they had asked several students, and I was one of several students they put in this newspaper article, that that World War II was something where people were fighting for something that was a worthy cause. We knew why we were in it. We knew that we were defending ourselves after Pearl Harbor was bombed. While I didn't really fully understand the full implications of what the Japanese were faced with and this whole imperialist thing, I wasn't fully aware and abreast of that, but I knew that from my father's fighting in the war and showing his patriotic response, that was a natural patriotic response, but that here we were fighting an alleged enemy 15,000 miles away from the United States that had never attacked us and had never shown any aggression towards the United States. And so my response was that, no, this is not something that I think that people should be fighting for. And so I was, these were things that, and my parents saw the article in the newspaper, so they knew they had to know that I was developing a political consciousness. And I'm sure that I probably mouthed off some things, but I don't remember sitting down and having this conversation. But it was at this point where things were. They knew that some sort of development was happening with their sons, because we were both arrested on the same day the king was assassinated, in association with this event at Franklin High School. And it was about a week later, because we were already, Aaron and I and a group of people from Seattle, BSU students, were already lined up to go to the West Coast Conference for Black Student Unions in San Francisco, at San Francisco State University. And Aaron and I had been talking much more about political organizing, and we actually had gotten a hold of a paper, a Black Panther newspaper. And so we were aware that the Black Panther Party existed and had some rough idea of who they were. But we didn't fully understand what they represented, but we knew that they were, developing into a powerful voice, at least in California, because the Black Panther Party started in 1966. It was not a national organization in 67 or 68, not yet. And here we were in the spring of 1968, and we traveled to San Francisco, and we had gotten wind that the day before Martin Luther King was assassinated, a young Black Panther by the name of Bobby Hutton had been assassinated and shot by Oakland police, and they were having his funeral that weekend. And a few of us said, well, we're going over to show our support. And that Saturday, we left the conference early and drove across the Bay Bridge into West Oakland. And I remember, I can still see the scene vividly in my mind today. When we got down on the street level in West Oakland, you started seeing large groups of Black people gathering. Some of them, there was one big gathering in a park or in some area. You had Panthers, both men and women, in leather jackets and berets, lined up in like platoon formation. And I remember seeing that and thinking, my God, this looks like a black army. And we had to get out, of course, blocks away from the church in order to find parking. And we were walking through, you know, this scene, and everybody had on leather jackets and berets and black slacks, and I remember seeing a group of people talking off to one side, and there were whites in this group, and one of them was Marlon Brando. I recognized Marlon Brando. He was talking to who I would later find out was Bobby Seale. And when
can you remember your reaction? I'm sorry to interrupt, but your reaction to seeing what you described as as a black army. What was it like to see?
It was overwhelming.
Yeah.
It was both it was kind of like a culmination of this discovering who I was as a young black man, and having developing a consciousness and an identity, but seeing a group that looked organized and ready to defend their community. It was very a stark contrast to the images that I saw on TV, with the singing demonstrators walking arm in arm, you know, singing "We Shall Overcome," because this looked like a group of revolutionaries who weren't talking about "We shall overcome." They looked like they were ready to take what was rightfully theirs in terms of their human dignity and their rights, and protect their community. And so it was a sense of pride, of defiance. It was almost an overwhelming sense of, you know, this is where I belong. This is who I am. And when we got inside the church to view the body of Bobby Hutton, when we stepped into the church, lining the walls all the way around were young black men and women in afros and berets and shotguns and bandoleros, and the casket was draped in a Black Panther flag, and all of these images, you know, were like it was a shock, you know, and I remember walking by the coffin, and I had heard that, you know, in conversation on the way there, that Bobby Hutton had been hit by 30 police bullets, and the reason why Mrs. Hutton, Bobby's mother, wanted the coffin to be open is so people could see what the police had done to her son. And I remember when I was filing by little Bobby's coffin and seeing him in there. He was 17 years old, and I was 17 years old. And I remember thinking that, you know, that could be me laying there. And I think that was the moment for me where I said, that's it. You know, this is who I am, and there is no turning back. And, you know, people often ask me about that era in my life and that period, and ask me if I was afraid. There was never any fear. I wasn't afraid to, and I can't speak for other people, but there was never a fear about putting my life on the line, or giving my life to the revolution, so to speak. It was a defiance and an indignant response to the racism and the racist brutality that the power structure in the United States had inflicted upon not only black people, but people of you know, people that didn't have means, whether it were poor whites, whether it be Native Americans, whether it be farm workers, you know, immigrant populations, anyone who was different from the status quo. It was like this immense, indignant response to this overwhelming oppression and dehumanizing of a people. And so that all kind of gelled for me in that moment, and I'm sure for many of us, as we headed back to the conference, we knew that Bobby Seale was scheduled to speak that night at the BSU conference, and we waited for him to speak, and he showed up with his bodyguards and several Panthers, and he gave probably the most fiery speech that I had ever heard. And after his speech, you were either afraid, because it was like a line was being drawn in the sand, or you were, destined to become a Panther and a revolutionary. A line was clearly drawn. And so a small group of us, Aaron, myself, 2 or 3 others, not the whole contingent that came from Seattle, but a few of us went over and cornered Bobby and said we wanted to start a chapter of the Black Panther Party in Seattle. And he told us to go ahead and finish this conference and return to Seattle, and that within 2 weeks he would be there, and he would outline for us what we needed to do to organize the chapter. And we set that up when his arrival would be, and the day that he came, there were probably 50 potential Panthers in my parents' home.
How did you put the word out?
I went out through the grapevine. The community has a grapevine, and it was 50 was a small core group at that time. And when my parents came home from work, all these bodies were laying on the floor and listening to Bobby talk, and they just came in, stepped over everyone, stepped around and over, went straight back into the kitchen, which was usually the gathering place, closed the door, and left us alone. See, because they knew something was coming, and this was the something. And we organized the chapter. Aaron, my brother, was given the leadership. He was the defense captain. I was field lieutenant, and we had a few other positions in there, and that began the journey. We were the first chapter to be organized outside of the state of California, and from that beginning, the chapters of the Black Panther Party spread like wildfire across the United States until we had a chapter in just about every one of the contiguous 48 states.
I'm curious what Bobby Seale said to you it meant to be a Panther, and whether that changed for you over time.
Well, it was pretty clear to us early on as we were trying to figure out, how we were going to organize, and of course it had to evolve, but it was clear to us, for most of us, that we were committed. We were in a lifelong struggle. He ran down the 10-point program of the Black Panther Party.
Can you just tell us what that is, the 10-point program?
Can you pause for 1 second?
Sure.
Are we back on?
We are now. Yes.
The interesting thing is that you were talking about, what it meant to be a member of the Black Panther Party, and most of us who were younger than 20 at the time, because I was 17, my brother would have been 19. He's about a year and 6 months older than me. And many of us were around that age group, 18, 19, 20, 17. Most of us who were serious, we either knew that we would be dead before we were 25, and those of us that accepted that reality didn't care. Those that looked at it and knew that if they stayed in the party they would be dead by 25, they probably were out of the organization within 6 months, because they weren't willing to go to that extent. And so what it meant was you had to be willing, you had to know what it meant to be a Panther, the fact that you would be probably in the line of fire now. Because it was in 1968, that very year, that J. Edgar Hoover claimed that the Black Panther Party was the #1 threat to the internal security of the United States. That's a pretty strong designation. That's how they talk about Al-Qaeda today. So if you put that in retrospect to 1968, and the party being named the #1 threat to the internal security of the United States, that meant we had a bullseye on us. And so it was important for us to understand what it meant to be a Panther, as you said. How did Bobby communicate that? Because in the early days of the Black Panther Party, and I presume that you will end up interviewing Bobby Seale for this this program. The party had organized around a couple of basic principles. One was that people had a right to live a life and pursue the American dream without being shot and killed and brutalized in their communities. And we didn't organize around civil rights, but we organized around what we believed were God-given rights. And the right to humanity and dignity was one of them. And when Huey and Bobby decided that they were going to form the Black Panther Party, they took the name from another organization that had the panther as a symbol. They were the Lowndes County Freedom Association. And they had the symbol of the Black Panther because the Black Panther by nature is a defensive animal. And so not an aggressor. So we didn't form initially to be the aggressor, but to take a defensive posture. And in fact, the first name of the Black Panther Party was the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. And so what had happened during those early years in '66 and '67, the first program that the Panther Party organized, we called them survival programs, was the Police Alert Patrol, because that was an immediate need in black communities across the United States, was to end the racist brutality by cops committed against black people, which is one of the points in the 10-point program. And I'll talk about the 10-point program in a minute. But when, in order to get that point across, Huey used to teach us that power is the ability to define phenomena and make it act in a desired manner. And when they defined that phenomena, the racist brutality in black communities, and in Oakland and LA have historical have a track record of historical racism and brutal treatment of black and Latino people. And in Oakland, in the 50s and 60s, it was routine for a black man to get shot or a black woman to get shot by police over minor incidents, a traffic incident or something, where cops would just unleash their brutality. And so when Huey and Bobby were first organizing the party, one, they armed themselves with the law. They understood that it's interesting that there's this gun debate going on now, and of course this was at a time when there wasn't a proliferation of guns in communities, let alone among kids in gangs now today. But when we were upholding the constitutional right to own and bear arms, the gun lobby today, the NRA, opposed Panthers owning guns. It's not surprising that, of course, they've done a 360 now today, and they want all the guns they can get. But at that time, we knew that we had the Constitution on our side. Huey and Bobby did. They also studied the California Penal Code and understood that legally that they had the right to carry arms and they had the right to observe police carrying out their duty. So they put those two together. They had also, one of the readings that they often read was the Red Book by Chairman Mao Zedong about revolutionary theory and practicing. And so when they organized the first program, the Police Alert Patrol, when they marched out on that street and faced down those cops on a Saturday night in Oakland with 6 or 7 Panthers with shotguns armed on the corner telling them they weren't going to brutalize that young man, that was really kind of the birth of the Panther mystique and the creation of the myth, if you will. Huey became a myth, almost a mythical figure from this. He was the one that led this incident when a police officer told him, what are you doing with that gun, nigga? Give me that gun. And he jacked around into the chamber of his shotgun and said, "This is my weapon. I have a right to carry this weapon. If you attempt to take it away from me, I'm going to defend myself." And it was that moment that really captured the imagination of those people in Oakland. And so the downside to that was that because we were called the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, people began to see the party as their own community defense force. So that meant, go get the Panthers to do this or go get the Panthers to do that. And that was not what we were about. We were setting the example that you had the right to defend yourself in your community and not have to take, people, brutalizing you unnecessarily, illegally, unlawfully, through racist attack, but you have the right to stand up and defend yourself and stand up like a man. That was the message that we were sending, that the party was sending very early. Well, that's initially what put the bullseye on our back. But as long as it was a localized organization in California, they didn't get a lot of attention. The FBI probably thought that would go away, but when this migration happened, and we were the first chapter, as I said, outside of the state of California, it became clear that this was going to be something that they were going to have to deal with. So the 10-point platform and program really was about the basic needs of people within our community. And I don't know if I can read all of this, but it talked about what we want and what we believe, and I can summarize, what the points were. We wanted the end to the racist brutality of police within our community. We wanted an education that represented the true nature of black people. We wanted an end to the robbery of our communities by what we called then the avaricious businessman, who took resources out of the community and never gave anything back. We wanted health care, food, land, housing, education, justice, and peace. Kind of summarize it all together. We wanted black men exempt from serving in military service. We wanted an end to all white juries trying blacks in the court when in fact they're guaranteed by the Constitution to have a jury of their peers. Those were the elements of the 10-point program. And so when he kind of broke that down to us, it really established what we were about, these were the things that we were going to pursue. And it was going to take a lot of organizing. We had to, because we had a bullseye on our back, we had to, every Panther had to own 2 guns and 1,000 rounds of ammunition, and be prepared to defend yourself because you would be under attack. We had to read 2 hours a day to educate ourselves and understand the concepts and theories of revolution and what it meant to be an organizer and a leader. And so we were basically preparing ourselves in those early years to become full-blooded revolutionaries that stood for something and that had a revolutionary philosophy and developed the tools that we needed to become revolutionary practitioners. And this meant that we had to we were giving our lives to this. And when the reality set in of the seriousness of it, see, we had the same kind of phenomena that happened in Oakland happened here in Seattle. When Bobby Hutton was murdered in Seattle, 1,000 people in the community joined the Black Panther Party overnight. It just exploded overnight. When we began to organize here in Seattle, within a couple of weeks we had 400, 500 Panthers that we were trying to organize and get into some sort of a disciplined structure. And a lot of people joined the Panthers, the party, because it was kind of the end thing to do is not the right word, but it was a source of pride and a source of belonging, source of identity. You know, this was during the turbulent 60s, and people wanted direction. But most people didn't really understand what it meant to, you know, to create a revolutionary movement. You know, a lot of people in the black community across the countries were used to spontaneous, you know, rebellions, and our movement wasn't about a spontaneous rebellion. You know, we were trying to build a political power structure that could challenge the status quo here in the United States. And we had to set out and build coalitions and you know, gather resources, and we had to know what it was that we were doing, and that took, you know, time and effort and commitment. And when it was clear,
discipline.
And discipline, and when it was clear that this is what it was going to take, you know, talk about reading 2 hours a day. I remember when I first picked up Wretched of the Earth and written by Frantz Fanon, I thought, my God, how do I understand this? But, you know, so we had political education classes every day, where, you know, not every day, but weekly, and where we would talk about what we read, and so we get an understanding of what other revolutionary movements were about. And we began to realize that it was going to take, you know, effort in order to build this this coalition and build this foundation, and so within 6 to 12 months, most of those Panthers that came that first few weeks were gone, and which was probably the best, because we boiled down to a hardcore group of Panthers, probably about 20. That we knew that we could count on, not just for the glory, because see, in that first summer we buried, I think, 2, maybe 3 Panthers here in Seattle. One of them, I think, it was either Butch Armstead's or Henry Boyer's funeral. I think it was Henry Boyer's funeral. Was the largest at the time, the largest funeral in the state. Thousands of people attended, and the Panthers we were all out in our, you know, our leather jackets and berets and powder blue shirts, and lining the streets, you know, in front of the mortuary. But so, you know, like, of course, you know, guys that put on this uniform, and even women, you know, but the guys, you know, it was like this macho thing. It was a source of pride, but it was also, you know, kind of, ooh, I'm a Panther. And when, you know, we had to, you know, kind of create this disciplined organization, it wasn't about, you know, just wearing the uniform and walking down the street and getting girls because you had a Panther uniform on. Yeah, we ended up, we expelled a lot of people left on their own, and we drilled down to this hardcore group of Panthers that were committed. And we began the process of political organization and kind of building this trust in the community. We started the...
what was that? Okay, if you could talk a little bit. You just need to...
Okay, we're back.
I was just going to ask about, you know, that difficult process. I would imagine a difficult process of boiling down and the expulsions and the infighting. And what was that like, since you were trying to do something for yourself, for your community, to experience that, those kind of difficulties?
I think we understood that was going to be a natural part of the process. Anytime when you are organizing something that is so involved and demanding of you as an individual, you know that there's going to be people that are not going to be able to adapt to that kind of a structure. It takes a certain person to be able to, you know, to kind of give of themselves completely and kind of fall into this, you know, this disciplined body, this disciplined organization. We were like a small army, and so it required that we that you kind of gave of yourself. It wasn't like some organizations that are like where you have this hierarchy and there's this submission. It wasn't like that at all. It was more like a family, and you had to have this close-knit family, but to kind of go through the growing pains to kind of get to that point, we realized it was going to be tough, and it was tough as we went through it. But I think that we understood, there's a core of us that understood what the party meant and what it stood for. And so we were going to do whatever it took to make sure that we came away with something that was going to be meaningful and make a difference and have an impact, because we're putting our lives out there on the line. Just because we began to do this community organizing didn't take the bullseye off our back, it increased it. In fact, a memo was sent out from our headquarters that said that leadership had to have 2 bodyguards. I had 2 bodyguards when I was 17 and 18 years old. Because we understood the seriousness of it. And so
Did you move out on your own at that point, or were you living at home?
I left that summer, and moved out on my own. In fact, I left probably, that was in April of '68. I graduated from Garfield in June of '68. By the end of June, I was out in my own apartment, and Aaron was already out, and it was. In those early days, when I was still at my parents' house, my bodyguard would come home with me at night and sit on my front porch, and I'd come up in the morning, he's still sitting there, and I told him, you can go home, I can take care of myself, but my parents would get calls in the middle of the night. My mother would answer the phone, and somebody would say, "We're going to kill that nigger son of yours tonight." And she would say, "Go ahead and try," because she knew that I could take care of myself, and she knew, and Aaron could take care of himself, and she knew that we also had people that were standing at our side. And those were some of the things that my parents went through early on in those years. My father was visited at his job by the FBI. You asked me earlier about him having to navigate Boeing. I don't remember. Like I said, I don't think he had to navigate Boeing so much. They were glad to have him, but it was when we became politicized that the FBI's interest peaked up. Here he is working on, in a manufacturing plant that had government contracts, and so he caught some heat behind that. But going through these growing pains, yes, it was painful, but at the same time, we knew it was necessary for us in order to evolve to where we wanted to. When we started our first free breakfast program in a church around the corner from my parents' home. It was a church that I had been a member of the Boy Scouts in, and the pastor quite naturally said yes, while other churches turned us down. This was a white pastor who said yes. Black churches told us no. This white pastor told us yes. It was because of that relationship that we had, and we realized, and we had members of the party who we had a Japanese Panther here, and a couple of Japanese Panthers here in Seattle. And while whites could not join the organization, our lawyers were considered kind of an extension of who we were. We had several white lawyers that were defending us in court. And when you began to realize and understand the philosophy of the Black Panther Party, I remember the 3 chapters in the Black Panther Party became targets immediately in 1968. When J. Edgar Hoover put out the memo to destroy, disrupt, and discredit the Black Panther Party by any means necessary out to his field offices, they targeted 3 offices that they wanted to shut down. In fact, in the memo he said, prevent the rise of a black messiah. And the 3 offices that he targeted were Los Angeles, Chicago, and Seattle. They already had the bullseye on national headquarters in Oakland, and they had already got, Huey was in jail at the time, so they already effectively pulled who they thought was the primary leader of the party out of the party, and Huey was locked up as a result of a gun battle he had with police, where he was supposed to be killed, but he was shot, but he ended up killing one police officer and wounding the other, and so they had him off the street, but L.A., Chicago, and Seattle were problematic for the FBI in their eyes, because in Los Angeles, you had the leader of the Black Panther Party there, Bunchy Carter, who was a former head of the largest gang in Los Angeles, the Slossons, and 5,000 members strong. And to have him as head of the Los Angeles chapter of the Black Panther Party and organizing, 5,000 gang members, let alone a truce between the other gangs, was very problematic for the FBI. In Chicago, you had the same thing where Fred Hampton was organizing not only the black gangs in Chicago, the Disciples, the Blackstone Rangers, but also getting the truce between them, but also organizing young whites and young Latinos. And in Seattle, we had this broad coalition of Asians, of Latinos, of whites, and so that and plus here we were a little a spot in the Northwest. A lot of people didn't even know where Seattle was. But if we had a major impact, then I guess that would have been problematic for them. So they targeted those three offices and with the idea of assassinating the leaders in those three chapters. Bunchy Carter was assassinated in Oakland, or excuse me, in Los Angeles. Fred Hampton, you're probably aware of his assassination in Chicago. And they had several attempts on Aaron and my life here in Seattle. One such attempt, Aaron, I used to run the target practice for Panthers once a weekend out at a target range that we had set up. And on one particular Saturday, I didn't go out with Aaron to the target range, and Aaron had gone out with a group of Panthers, and as he prepared to fire his shotgun, he at first was going to fire it from his shoulder. But he decided at the last minute he was going to try hip fire and brought it down to his hip, and the shotgun exploded. And it tore into his arm. He almost lost his arm. Of course, had he fired it from his shoulder, he would have blown his head off. And we knew that someone had doctored with his ammunition. And there were other attempts on he and I's life in those years. But something that Fred Hampton said in '68 at a large rally, and in fact there's a video out about Fred Hampton and his death, and this speech is on there where he says that he's talking to this large group on the south side of Chicago. In fact, he's on the west side of Chicago in a church, and there's white students in there, there's Latino students in there, probably Asian, a lot of black people in there. And what he said to them was that the reason why we say all power to the people, what we mean when we say all power to the people, is that we mean that that there should be white power for white people, brown power for brown people, yellow power for yellow people, red power for red people, and black power for black people, all power to the people. And what we need is a rainbow coalition. And he coined that phrase, not Jesse Jackson. It came out of Fred Hampton's mouth first. And so we had always, from the beginning, that was in 1968, we had a philosophy around what we called revolutionary intercommunalism. And so we had branches of the Black Panther Party in Australia, in Denmark, in Sweden, in Japan, in Germany. And so we had coalitions here in the United States with the Peace and Freedom Party, the SDS, the Young Lords, a Puerto Rican group, the Red Guard, the AIM, the American Indian Movement. We had coalitions with all of these organizations. And while we would discourage them from trying to join the Black Panther Party, we encouraged them to organize within their own communities. So we had this natural network and coalition that was really about a multicultural foundation to the Black Panther Party. And most people don't realize that don't know the history of the Black Panther Party. So when I did that speech in France a few years ago on from revolutionary to interculturalist, we had always been interculturalists in the Black Panther Party. but my upbringing had always been multicultural, so it was like it's been a full circle in my life. and for me personally, that began with the influences of my parents and where they had positioned us. So we went on to organize the chapter. We ended up with 5 breakfast programs where we fed over 2,000 kids a hot meal every morning before they went to school, and our breakfast programs were strategically located in housing projects around the city. 4 of the housing projects, all 4 of the housing projects, Yesler Terrace, Holly Park, High Point, Rainier Vista, and then one at the Atlantic Street Center, which had a more central location. We moved it out of the church and into, and oddly enough, the Atlantic Street Center was the very first neighborhood community center that we hung out in when we moved here from Chicago in 1957. The very first one. And the head of that organization at the time was a gentleman by the name of Ike Ikeda. And Ike knew us when we were kids. Mm-hmm. And when we went down there to ask him if we could have the breakfast program there, it was a natural response, of course. And so it was that kind of coalition that we had across the city in all of these different neighborhoods. Right. We had white liberals, some white wealthy liberals that were supporters of ours in those early years, and continued to support us throughout the years and even after the party went away. When we've done various events, but that foundation, that coalition that we built, sustained us through those years, because when the chapter shrunk down to a core member of people, we were probably more effective than we would have been with this large group, because we utilized the networks and the coalitions to host things and to get our word out and to build our programs. In fact, when during the peace marches, the anti-war demonstrations, there was a doctor by the name of John Green, who was a neurologist at the University of Washington Medical School, who would had put together a band of medical students and a medical detail that followed the demonstrators who were marching. And on the front lines, when someone got billy clubbed or tear gas, they would bring them to the back of these huge marches, and they would be administered health care to. Well, we approached John about a free medical clinic, and he was all gung ho and told us what we needed. And in our first, it's actually our second headquarters, because the first headquarters, the real headquarters, we had an office prior to there, but our probably one of our most notorious headquarters was up on 34th and Union, which ironically was around the corner from my parents' house, right there in Madrona. And the building is still there. But that was the first kind of notorious Panther office. But when we moved out of there in 1969, the fall of 1969, it was because of the attacks that were happening on party offices around the country. And so we were ordered into not only more secure offices, but barracks. So the building that we got was a duplex. Downstairs was our offices, and upstairs were the Panther barracks. And we had eventually 2 or 3 of those kind of buildings around the city, around the central area. And so our primary building was there on 20th and Spruce. And in fact, the People's Wall, we had an artist paint a wall around the building, which is still there. I don't know, you may want to go film that before you leave. It's on the corner of 20th and Spruce. We had it refurbished about 5 years ago on our 40th anniversary. But that was the office where we began to fortify the office. We had sandbags on all of the walls. We had bunkers inside for gun bunkers. We had steel and plyboard sandwiches on the window, and that was the first side of our free medical clinic. And Dr. Green set up the clinic in the back of the office. and he appropriated what we needed from the University of Washington. He told us to back up a truck up to the hospital. He gave, put in exam tables and medicine cabinets with, for the medications and equipment that he would need. He just loaded us up, and we established our first clinic there. He went actually on to open 4 other neighborhood clinics in the Seattle area, assist with opening those clinics. But so our first free clinic was there, put together by John Green. But the patients, when they came into the clinic, and our first service was a well baby clinic for young mothers to address the infant mortality rate was very high among in the black community in those years, and so that was our first concentration. And when the pregnant mothers would come in, they would walk by, of course, the officer of the day. That was the office when you came in through this door that was about this thick. And it was always guarded with an armed guard. They would walk in and then by the sandbags and through along the bunker and then back into the medical clinic to get their medical care. And people always said they felt secure when they walked in there.
Right.
It wasn't like they were fearful of these sandbags, but they knew who we were. They knew that we were offering a free medical clinic, and people came, and that was the birth of our first free medical clinic. And by the way, the Panther Clinic is still operating today. The Carolyn Downs Family Medical Center. Carolyn was a young woman who worked with us in the 70s and died when she was before she was 30, I believe, in 1978. We were no longer the chapter by then, but we continued the efforts of the organization. So we probably had over 30 programs that we had organized both here and around the country, the other chapters and branches. We had the free busing to prisons program. We had a free food program, which was some of the first free food banks here in the area. We had the free shoe program, a free legal aid program, a free busing to prisons program. I may have said that. Senior aid, legal aid, and then our summer liberation school, which was the foundation for creating what they did at Central Headquarters in Oakland, the Oakland Community Learning Center. My brother Aaron was transferred out of the chapter, as was the whole chapter, was transferred out of Seattle in 1971. And I was serving time in a prison in Oregon for allegedly stealing a leather coat while I was down speaking on the campus at the University of Oregon in Eugene, Oregon. And I spent 14 months in prison in Salem, Oregon, as a political prisoner. And I remember that hearing about some of the efforts that were going on when I was locked up. My parents, my father, and my brother had organized a meeting with the governor of Oregon at the time, who was a very progressive and liberal governor, Governor McCall, and they had arranged for a clemency hearing, and I didn't know, really how to respond to that, because I was a dyed-in-the-wool revolutionary at that point, and any concession was not within my power to give, nor was I going to give it. And appeared to be, in collaboration with quote unquote the enemy. I had been subpoenaed before I was locked up in 1970 before the House Un-American Activities Committee, and the reason why they subpoenaed me was because when they sent their congressional investigator out to find cooperative witnesses. Aaron instructed me to talk to the investigator, and he asked me. One of the things he asked me was, "Why do you feed kids a hot breakfast?" And I said, "Look, how are you going to ask kids to go to school that are hungry, and ask them to learn in a classroom where they're comparing, apples, 2 apples plus 4 apples equals 6 apples?" And expect their stomach to grumble? How they're going to focus and concentrate? It makes sense to give them a nutritional breakfast. And so when I explained our programs to him, why the free medical clinic, etc., so he took that to mean that I was a cooperative witness. But I was, basically instructed to explain to him why we had these programs. And so when I was subpoenaed, I was told that, if you get in there, this is the House Un-American Activities Committee. Mm-hmm. So I knew that my lawyers instructed us that, you can instructed me that I could answer my name and where I lived and what my occupation was. Anything after that would compel you to answer. So after I gave them those three things, I told them the very next question was, are you a member of the Black Panther Party? And I said, I refused to answer on the grounds of self-incrimination. I take the Fifth Amendment. And with each question, I grew more and more angry. It's kind of like the Nikita Khrushchev bouncing his shoe on the table. They were just so infuriated that that now they had flown me all the way to D.C. and I wasn't a cooperative witness. And so I knew, we were on one side and the government was on the other. So while I was in prison in '71, Attica erupted, and and George Jackson, who was a member of the Black Panther Party, was murdered in San Quentin. And after Attica, the captain of the prison called me and another Panther who was from the Portland chapter, Williams, Red Williams, called him and the two of us into the office, his office, and told us that if anything broke out in their prison, they were going to shoot us first. And so we knew that we were, still, even in prison, the targets. Mm-hmm. And so when the governor's office came to the prison, and the investigator said he was there for a clemency hearing to pursue clemency, that the governor wanted to pursue clemency. My response to him was, the only thing that you tell the governor that the only thing that I'll accept from him is an unconditional surrender. And the guy was like, who is this guy? Who is this guy? We're trying to get you out of prison. But I didn't want to get out under those circumstances. And so while I was there, the chapter was literally closed in Seattle. Yeah. Everybody was transferred to Oakland. And
were you organizing while you were incarcerated?
Oh yeah. Well, yeah. There was at least 3 other Panthers in that prison. They were Oregon Panthers and myself. And we had to do subtle things around organizing. We would meet. We'd had whole political education classes. There wasn't much more we could do other than keep ourselves abreast of what was going on, and being aware of, and not letting someone get taken advantage of in the prison. Protect ourselves while we're in prison. And so it wasn't the same level of organizing we would obviously do on the outside. The Oregon prisons are not what you would find in like a California prison, obviously. Where political organizing, it was a hotbed of, there was a need to do that kind of political organizing in San Quentin or in Soledad. The Oregon prison, it was not nearly the platform for that kind of thing. So we could keep ourselves abreast of what was going on, but there wasn't a need for this kind of broad organization. There weren't like gang warfares inside prisons, that kind of thing, which George Jackson was beginning to form a coalition between he organized the Latino prisoners and the black prisoners in San Quentin and Soledad, but we didn't have that opportunity in the prison that I was in, so it was much more low key in that way. But by the time I got out, I was paroled in late '72. The chapter. There was a group of community workers that were still there. They had moved into a new building. The old office with all the sandbags was gone. And you could see kind of the shift in the era, from those early years in the party to now just a few short years later, where, the sandbags were gone. We weren't sleeping with guns underneath our pillows, and, it was a very different time. But we still went about the business of organizing the community, and that meant through organizing our survival programs. And so the clinic was now in another building, in the offices that we had now. No one, while we did have a 24-hour guard, someone had to be at the building at 24 hours at all times. No one, lived there. And
can I ask you about it? There's
Okay, we're back.
Well, I was going to ask you about, because there's the famous sort of split, right, in as it's sometimes called within the Panthers, about do we continue this sort of militarism and the guerrilla revolution, or focus on survival programs and meeting the basic needs of black people. But it sounds like your description of what happened in Seattle, there's still kind of a mix of the two, or how did you see it playing out?
Well, there was that mix of the two. There was a mix of the two, probably in every chapter. We had that kind of mini split, if you will, in our chapter early on in probably early 1969, and there was in fact, he was our brother-in-law who had more of a military, let's do it now kind of a mentality, and did some things that were kind of contrary to what we were about and what we considered to be, sensationalizing, sensationalism. And so there was that ideological split here in Seattle. But they faded quickly. In fact, several of them went to prison for a bank robbery. Others kind of just faded into and it's a little more involved than, I'm not going to name names. But that split occurred. And, we maintained control of the organization and continued to build the structure that Huey and Bobby wanted in the first place. The big ideological split on the national level was really perpetuated by informants and the FBI through COINTELPRO. It wasn't just about assassinating leaders, because they could only get so many, and they would only have so many opportunities. They blew a couple of opportunities here in Seattle. They weren't going to get that opportunity again.
Can you define what that is, just for
what opportunities?
COINTELPRO.
COINTELPRO was a program actually put together by Hoover way back in the 30s, 20s and 30s, when he was consumed with the idea that the communists wanted to take over the United States and the communist threat. And so COINTELPRO is an acronym for counterintelligence. So we've been relentless spying and eventually tapping, and it was active, all through the union busting years in the 40s, breaking up the unions during the McCarthy era, when they went on the witch hunt and blacklisted top actors from Hollywood, on into the civil rights movement when they wiretapped Martin Luther King and wiretapped Kennedy's. And so it kind of evolved into when the party emerged. It was the new threat that they saw as a bigger threat even than King, and so all of the COINTELPRO's energies now were directed towards revolution across the United States, and the Panthers were at the top of the list. That's why he declared the party the #1